Gibney says we boomers benefited from investments in roads, new schools, education. But when it was the boomers' turn to give, we continued to take.
The average age of this 52nd Parliament is 49 years old. Okay, boomer. Current political institutions have proven themselves incompetent of thinking outside of a short political term. Change is so regularly sacrificed for power.
Okay, we bought houses when they were way cheaper. But does that make us sociopaths?
We're talking about the Millennial Millions clip. Now, you'll notice that we watched the Saturday Night Live, the spoof on why millennials and younger generations are angry at boomers. We were not watching that clip on YouTube. I don't know if it's because it went into the Saturday Night Live vault that it was in a season that went away. It was recent, though. Like, the reason why this is important is it came out in the last like 3 or 4 years. So there are Redditors who are speculating that they removed that clip because it was too ageist, that it was divisive between millennials, boomers, and Gen Xers.
Gets to be like elderly abuse kind of thing, bullying of some sort, right?
Yeah, it could very easily be seen as bullying, and that's what today's episode is about: is the younger generations bullying the older generation, and whether or not it's fair. And I apologize to do this to you, but I'm going to recap real quick what the generation ranges are. We have the greatest generation that was born in 1901 to 1927. They punched Nazis in the face. They stabilized the economy. They came home and built the middle class. They demanded picket fences. They had 3.5 kids, and they had a lot of sex. And what that led to is the biggest age cohort we've ever seen on the earth. Like they had so many children. They made the baby boomers. So when they were fighting in the war, the teenagers that were currently living were the silent generation. When they grew up, they didn't have a war to fight. They just quietly put their head down and went to work and lived in the economy that the greatest generation established. So that's why they're called the silent generation. Is they basically just worked within the system built by the greatest generation, the Nazi punchers. Baby boomers were basically one of the first generations born in advanced medicine times. So they were effectively the biggest bubble of living peoples who have come out of modern society.
Well, I guess too, it's we think about longevity of life that starts from when you're born, and the vaccines and the health and the food and nutrition.
Right, they weren't dying of polio or whatever FDR had during World War II. So like you're dead on. And so if you're a baby boomer, according to the internet, if you are born between 1946 and 1964, so you're the older boomers are born so that they are effectively teenagers during Woodstock, if that gives you an idea of when that is. Now, we established earlier that Todd is part of Generation X. Generation X, again, were teenagers when the baby boomers were adult working years. They were born 1965 to 1980. And in that Millennial Millions skit, I think they make the joke, the host of the fake Millennial Millions show, where they're bashing on how much boomers have taken from the economy. Keenan makes the joke of, I'm Generation X, I just sit on the sidelines and watch the world burn. That's your generation, Todd, according to pop
Sounds
culture.
about right. That sounds about right. Yeah, the skit is very funny. Saturday Night Live to me is either hilarious or it's horrible. And this is definitely a hilarious one, and it's definitely relatable because everything they say is true.
Yeah, and it's I think it stoked contention, which is why I think it's off YouTube. But yeah, it was dead on everything they said, and that's why it was kind of the inception of the idea for this episode, which is, let's talk about boomer hatred in culture, because after your generation comes the generation that truly puts out hatred toward the boomers. That's the millennials. Now, I am technically a millennial. I am almost too old to be a millennial, 1981 to 1996. And I'm at the very start of that cohort. And the reason why they make the joke that Generation X is sitting on the sidelines is because they're too small of a voting cohort to change much. Like the silent generation, they're a smaller cohort. They don't get as many votes. They don't sit in as many seats in Congress. So like they don't have the hand on the power lever like other big voting groups do. Millennials do. Millennials are big. Not as big as baby boomers to start with, but they're big enough to, well, it's basically suffer through the economy that was built. After us is the generation that people are starting to be afraid of, which is the young generation just entering the workforce and coming out with college degrees, which is Generation Z. And then their children, which I've never heard this term before, is the Generation Alpha. That's 2013 to present. Now, I don't know who's doing all the mockery. I suspect it's mostly millennials, but there is so much anger toward boomers that it's getting ridiculous. I was reading article after article of boomers who are columnists for major magazines defending their generation, and they seemed shocked that there was so much hate. You sent me a clip, or no, you sent me to the show Righteous Gemstones, which is a hilarious show about a super church or mega church, family who runs it.
Joel Osteen size spoof almost.
Right, and it's got these great comedians. It's got Danny McBride in it and stuff. But out of nowhere, like they're not even talking about boomers in the Righteous Gemstones. They randomly just stop and like the sister is like just says boomers are an entitled, selfish generation, and then there's no joke after that. That's just it. She just says it. In the Saturday Night Live skit, there's a joke where like this millennial is playing. I think she's playing for like Social Security, and she is bashing on a boomer who walks out, or she's bashing on a boomer who walks out and is going to take the Social Security she just won on this game show. And she is complaining. She's like, this woman worked as a banker for 30 stable years, got an $8 million severance, and moved to Key West. And then there's another boomer who's like, he owns 6 vintage cars, yet somehow he's an orthodontist. The point SNL was making there is that being born in an era of stability, it built the average person's wealth up. Like the stability built people's wealth up, not necessarily hard work or cunning. And that's not my point. That is the point SNL is making, is that you didn't have to be smart to get rich at the end. There are books, self-help books that were written in the boomer era about how everybody can be a millionaire. And it was actually true. Like there is, if you were smart, you put away your money wisely, you invested.
There's pensions too. It was different. It was just a different playing field. There wasn't 401s that you have to actually save money. It was actually just given to you.
Right.
It's a little different. Yeah.
Yeah.
Companies to hire you had to have that. It was the standard.
Right. And the reason all that existed is like, pensions. Oh my God, that's a whole episode. Medical insurance, that's a whole episode. The way loans are handled, especially student loans, that's a whole episode. These are all systems that were put into place by the greatest generation, who came back and just had so many demands. Like they survived the worst war we've seen, and they were like, no, we have so many demands that we need these things from work. Like they changed a industrial society that basically never treated them right. They came home and they voted, and they got representation. They got into city councils, they got into Congress, they changed things. And that system that had so many good safety nets and so many safer avenues of saving money, and that's the thing, is those all exist today. They're just not as safe as they used to be, or they're trickier, or they're predatory. In the category of weird boomer hate, George Carlin has like a rant about them. Like he goes on this like 5 minutes, and he just talks about, like, here's a direct quote. He says, "Baby boomers are whiny, narcissistic, self-indulgent people with a simple philosophy. Give me that, it's mine." And then he yells out over and over again on stage, "Give me that, it's mine."
When I have seen this in my day job, I do estimates for a construction company, and there really is an excess of everything. You know, the one of the satellites they're talking about the guy having 7 guitars and 7 vintage cars and 3 different houses, and then complaining about taxes and then saying, I can't retire because, you know, and it's just like a greed factor of, you know, I don't even have time to drive these cars or play all these guitars.
Right. I'm managing my own savings and wealth and yeah, my vault. It's a job. So we're gonna bust myths here. I want to go through this step by step, like a courtroom, and figure out, is all the boomer hatred justified? What did the boomers actually accomplish? What have they left in place for the younger generations? Who is defending boomers right now in the pop culture? So we're going to hear from magazines and like editors and columnists and, you know, people in the news, and just who are the voices defending boomers? Who are the voices telling them, you know, go die in Key West? And we're going to hear the phrase "Okay, boomer." And that's become like the millennial rallying cry to shut up a boomer, is when they start saying, you should have saved more money, you know, you didn't make good choices in your college degree. You know, the reason why millennials are the poorest generation currently is because we didn't do a good job of setting ourselves up economically. And I'm going to start off with my own sort of thought of, I don't think any generation is any dumber or weaker or worse off than any other. I think humans just across the board are relatively the same year by year. If you go back and look at ancient Rome, and like there's a website called Ancient Roman Graffiti, and we're the same people as we've ever been. Like we've never changed. We get educated earlier. Our IQ is slightly higher because of like the Flynn effect, but as a species and as an emotional drive, we don't change really. Like the same.
That's interesting, because it does feel like
us.
we've evolved and become more complex, and so depression and lust are all it's the same, right? It's always been like that. Nothing's new.
So we're establishing ourselves as a not an objective authority, but like we're going to say we have the at least the self-awareness to adequately, you know, pick out who's judging, who's the prosecution, who's the defense. The accused, of course, is the baby boomers. Economically, what did they have going for them? You know, younger generations say you guys had it super easy. And then the boomer comeback is, we worked our asses off. So let's look first at degrees, because that's like education is the great bootstrap. Like if you want to talk about the thing that separates you from lower classes to middle class, it's a degree. So World War II happened. The greatest generation came home, had a lot of kids. That greatest generation, about 15% of them got their college degrees. They got a bachelor's or higher. Their children, who grew up in an extremely prosperous time, they doubled that. So like,
well, that's substantial then.
Yeah, the guys shooting at Nazis were not educated. They came from farms. They came from industrial areas. They worked in slaughterhouses and iron smelters and things. They were not educated. And when they came back, even after they came back and had time to educate themselves, only 15% ended up with a degree. Boomers, 30% had degrees, 30% went to college of some sort. So like, not only did they double the degree amount, they doubled how many of them just got some education in general.
But that's a sign of a more sophisticated economy too. Like Gladwell says, if you can say what you do in a job in one word, or if you have to explain what you do, then you're in a more sophisticated economy, right?
Right. Yeah, it's a more sophisticated economy already. And then as that progresses, like, of course, you know, when you have a more educated group of people, you get a larger, more stable middle class. And as the SNL, I think is Edie in SNL sang, she said, and then they got all the jobs and they made all the money and they bought all the houses and they won't ever die, is the lyric she sings in Millennial Millions, the skit. Now, the crimes that they are accused of, we're going to talk about, what they have done with that education, that stable economy, and that money. According to millennials who are accusing them, they had the most votes. Now that is a significant factor that doesn't come up in a lot of arguments. When your millennial children yell that you had it easy, very rarely do they make the complicated argument of you had the most voting cohort in politics. So that's significant.
They don't know that. You undug that.
Right. So what that means is if you have a giant group of people, like it doesn't matter who you are, whatever generation you are, traditionally before this, I mean, literally before World War II, people believed that if you had a very large group of people as a voting cohort and as a generation, they'd compete with each other. That you wouldn't get the best laws and you wouldn't get the best advantages because you'd be competing with your peers.
But it makes sense that they would have similar views because they were raised in a similar environment.
Right. I've heard groups of millennials, my group, complain that there's too many millennials. They're like, I have to compete with 20 other people with my same job degree and my same title to get a job at a brokerage. And that's not necessarily the case, because if you are in not just a big generation, if you are the biggest generation, yeah, you compete with your other group to get a job, but you can also change the laws to make better jobs and make jobs that are more fair and jobs that provide more. Like you change laws at that point if you have the biggest group of people to suit you. So you don't necessarily need to compete with each other. Like if you're all around the watering trough and there's enough room, but you're also the biggest generation that's ever happened, you make another watering trough. You make 3 troughs. So that's basically the accusation. The crimes accused of the boomers is they had the most sway that has ever happened in Congress and in the Senate, and they still do. According to Pew Research, Gen Xers, Millennials, and the Silent Generation, who are also in Congress, all combined still have less than half the seats that boomers hold. So I'm gonna repeat that real quick. All the other generations combined hold half or less of the seats that boomers hold, despite millennials now being larger than boomers as a population. So it's not like there are so many boomers right now living that, of course, half of Congress is boomers. They they're representing equally. Like it's not a if you're talking generation strictly, it's not a equal representation. It is just a lot of boomers who have held onto their seats forever, and middle-aged millennials now who are like, we still don't have representation, and we're still not getting laws that favor younger people who need to start families. We're getting laws that favor people who are in their retirement strictly, and that is the accusation. Like I said, that is not my words. Those are people who complain about voting cohort disparities. And the total amount of people now that boomers have gotten older and some of them have passed away. I said that they were, boomers are the biggest generation that ever existed. They're now about the same size as millennials. If you talk just overall population, boomers and millennials each make up about 20% of the population. So it's ships passing in the night. They've equaled out now. So what are the regulations that boomers put into place? Their parents, the greatest generation, like I said, they came from farms and factories. They came back from the war and demanded better rights, better safety nets, better regulation. So the kind of regulation that would stop predatory loaning in, like, say, medical systems. Todd and I have talked in past episodes about how absolutely Wild West crooked the medical insurance system is. That if you don't have a job that directly provides you medical insurance, if you're a freelancer like I am, if you are underemployed, meaning you just don't hit full-time hours, or if you have multiple jobs and each one of those doesn't reach the requirements for medical, you have to pay for your own insurance. And it is a minefield of middlemen who want to take your money and give you subpar insurance or just something that's not going to actually cover you at all. Recently, I had a radiology screening. I am covered, like I am on insurance, and they just flat refused a radiology scan that was desperately important. Like it was shocking that it wasn't covered. Schools, we talk about one of the biggest things that another huge contention between millennials and boomers is predatory loans. It's school debt. Now the argument there is that millennials sling this like an arrow. They say, we have college loans that will never be repaid, and it's dragging down an entire generation of millennials. And the argument against that, and I agree with this, is you shouldn't have taken a degree in underwater basket weaving. You shouldn't have taken a degree in like art studies, or you shouldn't have taken a degree that will never make money. Like, no, we can only have so many, Russian literature majors or people who have studied, the intricate, the intricacies of like the French ballet. And that's kind of like an easy argument to make. I see that online a lot. But what we don't really talk about is the middlemen who gave out those loans. Like, it wasn't, 20% of the entire population, millennials, they did not, of their own accord, sitting at home when they reached the age of 18, start the complicated process of taking out a loan. That's not something you can do at 18. Like you can try, and some, tell any 18-year-old, hey, go get a business loan, or you're old enough, go to a bank and start the complicated process of taking out a $100,000 loan on your own. Get the requirements together, get the paperwork together, go do it. That is not something you can do without, credit and finances, money, an education that allows you to know how to do that. According to the House Financial Services Committee, they believe about 45 million students were directly preyed upon by under-regulated loan servicing systems or companies, meaning that we blame millennials for getting degrees in underwater basket weaving. The response to that is, we had people showing up to colleges like military recruiters who were handing out loans and who were convincing us that we were going to be able to afford to pay it back quickly once we had a degree, and that all degrees were worthwhile, and that these predatory loan companies, I mean, like it's not even like millennials were walking into offices in the college campus to get these loans. They were coming to you. Like we had loan people who showed up at our high school for our graduating class. So like they called them college recruiters. What they were is I don't remember the name of the company, but it wasn't the government. It was a company that took on the loans, and then once people defaulted on those loans, would pass it on to creditors or the government. And fun fact, there's the other argument that they make in that episode, or in the Saturday Night Live Millennial Millions. I'm going to actually ask this as a question. How much, Todd, do you think college degrees have gone up since 1978 when boomers went to college?
I'm going to say 300%.
Okay, that's a good guess. Adjusted for inflation, like that's the other thing, is a lot of people argue inflation numbers. So this is according to Bloomberg, who is not like a millennial happy magazine. Bloomberg is kind of right wing and kind of old.
Very conservative. Very conservative.
Conservative, and it's run by boomers. So by their math, adjusted for inflation, since boomers went to college, it's gone up 1,100%.
Okay, so I was way too high. So that I've been buying into the. It used to be free, and now it's $1 billion.
Yeah, basically.
That's telling too, right?
Now, there are people who are listening who are going to think that I am defending the millennial position that, like, we're not. My quote unquote generation isn't at fault for taking on terrible loans. I blame everybody. Like I think it is the individual's responsibility to realize that they are sitting in front of a scumbag who is trying to sell you a loan for something that's gone up 1,000% in its inflation, or that's gone up in price 1,000% in the last 40 years, and that you're never going to pay that back. I am sitting comfortably from a position of I dropped out of college when I ran out of money. I didn't take loans. I am currently now taking classes again. I think that I can sit on a high horse of I've never really been in debt except for temporary because of fighting the medical system in different circumstances. But that's not necessarily a good thing because I'd never actually finished my degree. I got a PI license, and I've held trade licenses basically in security industries, but I haven't actually felt the sting of a crazy student loan because that was my father. Like my father had student loan debt until he died,
But
literally till the day he died.
and your personality is you're very conservative and you're a saver. I mean, you're just not a spender. You'll look for ways to to
Yeah,
save.
I think that is because I witnessed crushing destructive debt all throughout childhood, and I was like, oh, okay, now that's what happens when you get on the hook, financially for anything. Um, I will say, just personal opinion, most of the accusations I've heard against boomers, I think, are bullshit. But the idea that they had the most votes and they currently hold Congress, they've held it for a long time. The accusation that boomers have spent their voting years dissolving regulation, and now corporations own everything, from the loans being taken out by teenagers and houses being bought by out-of-state companies and turning them into rentals at the maximum price, and third-party medical insurance groups that prey on people in a crisis. I know I sound anti-capitalist right now, especially, which is weird for me coming from somebody who is basically an ex-libertarian. But all of these basically stem from deregulation. And if we're going to accuse the boomers of something, that's something you don't hear from a millennial who, like, your children, if you're a boomer, your child has never slammed the door on you and screamed, "You had it easy. My problems stem from your generation's deregulation." That is not something that is screamed, I don't think. um, Now, I will kind of like wind this back. You are a private business owner, and you've kind of worked within the system. You've owned multiple companies or small businesses. Do you feel like regulation has ever been like let you down, like medical or loans or something? Have you felt that sting? Do you feel like things are less are should be less regulated or should be more regulated?
I think with regulation comes cost. So no, I feel like it's a way of just being taken advantage of, especially small businesses. Small businesses, you get hit on every single thing. You're just being fined almost to death, and then you actually get taxed not just on your business, through the state and through sales tax and wherever you operate, but then also on your personal things. So you actually get it twice. It's very, very hard for a smaller business owner. You don't get the advantages of the tax stuff that the big businesses get.
Right. I think that is the rebuttal to whether or not deregulation was a good thing. Because boomers, as a generational cohort, they favored Reagan and Reagan's outlook on finances and economy. So the cutting of safety nets and the deregulation that we're seeing, a lot of it was to build small businesses and to build the middle class. Like a lot of it, in good spirit, was to make it easier to build a business like you have. I just think that that deregulation has led to a lot of predatory activity from companies. Do you remember the episode where we talked about the root of the housing crisis? We had a whole thing where we talked about David Lord Willett's. Oh, he's a
No,
he's a
I don't recall that one.
okay. we've now had so many episodes about the housing crisis that I don't blame you. I've forgotten, or my brain has like smeared them all together into sort of just this gray mass of episodes we've talked about. He is the Minister of State for the Universities and Science and Paymaster General. He was the Lord Commissioner of the Treasury. He was a member of British Parliament. He's also known as the Right Honourable and the Lord Willets. So he is Britain's money man. Like he is he's basically like the whiz bang genius of Britain, and he is, you know, he was their Paymaster General and Parliament and all that stuff. He wrote a book called The Pinch. And our very first episode about housing, I think when we first started talking about it, I just went with him. Like my answer to why are we having a housing crisis, I wasn't blaming boomers. I was blaming the same people that he blames. He blamed older generations who bought up all the starter homes before younger people could get to it and start families. And instead, they bought up all the starter homes and additional accessory units and turned them into rentals. And that's, I mean, like that is such a standard playbook now that me saying that may not even ring on anyone's ears as alarming. At the time, he was ringing the bell, like he was saying, "This is going to crush our economy in 20 years. We're all dead." And at the time, it kind of fell on deaf ears because it didn't seem like a big deal. The guy who wrote Rich Dad Poor Dad, he had written his book, and his advice or his method of getting rich was he had invested in rentals and housing. That's what everybody was doing. Like that's you go to your money manager at a bank, they were going to tell you, you know, hey, if you want something safe, invest in housing, like buy 3 or 4 extra houses. You know, in the 90s, houses were a terrible investment. In 2008, they were a crashing investment. But then after that, it became a pretty safe thing to do. Like you bought a house, or you bought 3 or 4 extra houses, you rented them out. That was going to be your retirement money. Well, what that ended up happening is too many people gave that advice. Too many people read Rich Dad Poor Dad, and it led to a absolute removal of starter small family homes. And then Airbnb happened. And then basically the housing crisis we're in is because now nobody has access to starter homes. Like anybody who is younger than a boomer cannot get into a starter home, period, the end. We had a whole episode last month or the month before about now there are investment companies that will go in and buy privately owned houses and turn them into rentals at maximum price. Like they will come in and like they'll you know, one of these retirees, these boomers we're talking about, they'll have 3 homes, and these people will offer them, hey, sell us one of your 3 homes. It's a crappy little rental that you use for side money. We'll give you maximum price. We'll literally pay you, you know, $200,000. We'll give you the amount you want. Just give it to us. And then they sell it. And then what they do is they turn around, and as a company has bought this from you. They flip that home, and they now charge $2,500 in rent if you're living in Florida, and there's no getting it back. That now belongs to a company, and you cannot get it back into the hands of the public again. That's the big trend we're moving toward. David Lord Willett warned everybody about this. He's like, hey, you know, this isn't necessarily a knock on boomers. I hope this isn't coming off as a skewer. This was him warning everybody 20 years ago that this was happening. And now we're kind of sitting in that mess.
Rich Dad Poor Dad's worth $120 million, just so you know.
Yeah, I bash on him a lot, but he could buy our podcast, and
he's annoying as fuck, though. He really is, you know.
Yeah.
Talk about higher social class. And,
yeah, Robert. Yeah, it's Robert Kiyosaki. Is he a boomer?
He would be. But by the looks of his age lines, it looks like it is to me.
Oh my God! On Rich Dad, on his website, he has an article called "How to Survive the Coming Baby Boomer Retirement Crisis," which is what we're basically going to be talking about in 10 seconds. Like that is what the subject of today is about.
That's
okay.
Perfect.
Yeah, that is absolutely gold. So there is a counselor to Clinton. We're talking about the prosecution here, where we're still talking about the accusers who are bashing on boomers. The canary in the coal mine was David Lord Willett, who said this housing thing is going to bite us in the ass. Please stop, using them as assets instead of places to live. Um, Paul Begali, who was one of Clinton's counselors, he's a political writer, political counselor. He did an Esquire article, and he wrote the following. I'm just going to quote him. He said, "Quote: If demographers call you a boomer, you probably hate our generation's elite as much as I do. It is my contention that the single greatest sin a generation can commit is the sin of selfishness. And it's from this standard that I draw my harsh conclusion." Which is to say, instead of taking risks and trying to make things better for their children, which is something every generation is expected to do, boomers basically voted for policies that made it riskier for their children economically. They voted for policies that, were riskier, made it riskier physically and mentally for millennials. Millennials aren't going to live as long as boomers by like a couple of years, I think is the last estimate. And boomers built nest eggs out of the housing that was available, and they voted for tax breaks instead of better schools. So that's the argument that is made against boomers. Like, we're to tie everything into a neat bow. That's the short and skinny of it. That is, they have their hand on the lever of power. They haven't made it easier for the next generation. They've made it harder. And it was because they got used to a really, really cushy economy. And instead of as the world's economy is going to shit, it's not just America that's kind of like, we're not doing so great recently. It's, the world is struggling, but boomers want it to be as easy as it was when they started. Like they got adjusted to a pretty nice setup, and so they keep voting on tax breaks and they keep voting on things that will keep it that way for them, specifically for their age cohort. Does any of this sound crazy or unfair? Like, I don't want to read all of the accusation, make it sound like it's my own opinion and sound totally insane.
No, you sound great. You sound great.
Okay. Now we're going to get into the defense. I almost wanted to like invite somebody older to read this stuff, because again, I don't want to like sound like I'm speaking out of my generation group or out of my league. But I'm just going to read from a couple of writers who put up a pretty good defense. The comment section wasn't very favorable to them because some of the stuff they said wasn't super well thought out. The best article I could find, and this is the one that everybody online was reacting to. Like, this became such a big smash hot button article that it garnered a lot of hate and a lot of argument. The article is called "Millennials' Extreme Hatred for Baby Boomers is Totally Unjustified," and this was in the New York Post. It went viral. Like, it was and the author is Stephen Kuzo, who is a newspaper editor, a restaurant critic, and a real estate columnist, and he's also a boomer. I didn't need to say that last part, the boomer part. I could have just said newspaper editor and restaurant critic, and people probably would have guessed boomer was coming next. But yeah, he wrote for the New York Post that boomers being hated on is unjustified. And his arguments, some of them have already been debunked, and I'll put those out first so that we can say that if you go to read this article, there are some sections that don't exactly line up all the way. He said he claims that boomers won the Cold War against communist tyranny, and along the way brought us unprecedented prosperity and tech innovation. Now, that is true as a voting cohort, as a large group. Boomers lived through the Cold War. They lived through basically the biggest, scariest thing that could happen, which is total existential threat all the way. Like, I don't mean to like imply that you are older than you are, Todd. Did you ever have to duck and cover? Like, did you hear about the fallout drills from nuclear bombs?
No, I am not that old.
Okay, I'm sorry. I apologize.
I wasn't you worried about the Cuban Missile Crisis. No, I read
I,
about it.
okay,
I
I won't
heard
ask about
about
black
that.
and white TVs.
Those I do. They gave you a headache. I do remember when I was the remote control, and where your parents would kick you and say
Go
change it
switch
to
it
channel
on.
6. There were 3 channels, and then they didn't all come in well, so you had to use Reynolds wrap, and you had to wrap those around. That was just common. Yeah, and if you had cable TV, you were wealthy. Yeah, you were wealthy if you had cable TV. So I am that old.
Okay. That gives me a little bit of a more comfortable basis. I don't feel quite as bad asking you about if you lived through nuclear scares. So, but if you are defending a generation, that's a damn good defense. Is saying that we lived through the greatest threat existentially that any human could, which is a bomb could come out of nowhere and wipe out everything all at once. Now, I will say that the rebuttal to that, the idea that boomers won the Cold War. The Cold War presidents, I'm going to read them. There's a lot of them because the Cold War was like 40 years. It was Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, and Bush. Of those, how many do you think were boomer presidents, like in the age cohort?
Give me that one more time.
Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan. And finally, the Cold War technically ended with Bush.
And how many were what?
Boomers?
You mean their age or in that generation?
Yeah, that they were a boomer or that they were in the boomers age generation.
Shoot, I can't do the math. I don't know.
Okay, I'm being mean. It's a trick question. None of them were boomers.
None of them. Yeah, I was gonna say they'd all be too old.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
5 were from the greatest generation. 2 were from the lost generation. 2 were from the silent generation. So technically, his claim that boomers won the Cold War against communist tyranny, yeah, they did. But they weren't directly making the policy that did it. In some cases,
decisions. They were just around. They were just there. Yeah.
It's kind of like me claiming that millennials beat Al Qaeda. We really didn't. Like, we had boots on the ground, but like millennials certainly weren't in the halls of power. We weren't making decisions. We weren't president.
No, and there's always some gray-haired person that's still making all the decisions.
Right. Exactly.
There's still some adults making decisions that all those kids suffer for.
Right. Now, there's another claim that he makes, and again, we're going to go through what credit is deserved. This author claims that baby boomers were more socially and environmentally conscious and contributed significantly to social progress. They opposed the Vietnam War. They brought up feminism. They were there for Mexican American activism and environmentalism. Now, I will say this comes from me because I have actually read quite a lot about the history of the Vietnam marches. Those were not boomers. Like, some of them were. But most of those were college kids. It was a classism thing, not a generational thing. Boomers get credit as a generation who marched against Vietnam. But I've dug up Pew Research polls, which I will link here in case anybody is asking, like who thinks that I'm wrong on this. Boomers supported the Vietnam War, like by a generation when asked. Here's the question they asked during the polls in the years 66 to 71. They asked people of all generations, in view of the developments since we entered the fighting in Vietnam, do you think the U.S. made a mistake sending troops to fight? This is a Gallup poll from 1966, and the vast majority of boomers said, no, we did not make a mistake. We should be in Vietnam. It was the college kids, the long-haired hippie college kids who were protesting. While most boomers actually supported the war, the younger generation supported the war. The greatest generation, the older generations, did not. They had seen war, like they had punched Nazis in the face. They didn't like it. They it sucked. It was cold, and there was a lot of shooting. But the boomers hadn't seen war, and so they mostly supported it. They thought it was okay. They didn't think we made a mistake going into Vietnam, even as we chased them into Laos. They didn't think so.
Stuck on stubborn and stupid, right?
Yeah. I will say though that the rest of it, I think his assessment is correct. I think that it is accurate that boomers did. His argument that boomers were more socially and environmentally conscious. I agree with that. Like they basically invented, Greenpeace and the environmental movement. I don't know if it's stuck. I don't know what your opinion on how climate activism is going right now. I
I
yeah,
think it's gaining steam. I think it's
I think so too. I should honestly have looked up which generations are more environmentally conscious right now. But certainly in the 70s, it was the boomers leading the fight against whaling, like Greenpeace and the don't kill the whales and stop polluting and stop putting things in the ozone. I give boomers all the credit for basically starting that. I think a lot of them have defaulted to money though in older age. Um, there's the old yarn about how you get more conservative as you get older. I think a lot of them have sided with lower taxes and not necessarily giving a shit about climate change.
I think your value comes into that too, because you're not pretty or gorgeous anymore, so you
Yeah,
or fit or fun, so you have to get kind of your values and your stuff and hoarding your wealth.
right. If I'm personally not a 10 anymore, at least my assets are a 10. Now, the rest of this article's argument, I think the reason why he drew so much heat is because he started by making some pretty good arguments about what the boomer generation accomplished, which is pretty awesome. And then the rest is bashing on millennials. I shit you not. The latter half of his article is just shitting on millennials. Like his argument, and you, it's okay if you write an article that is crapping on millennials, but his article was a defense of boomers. Like it was supposed to be his article from the title. The hate for boomers is unjustified is the title of his article, and he spends half of it as an attack, which is really not the way to go if you're defending your generation. And his method of attack is he dissolves into this sort of like rant about like he says I'll just quote him. He talks about like he turns this into he's a boomer columnist who's also a food critic. He's talking about the millennial making his coffee, and he says, quote, but many quote unquote working members of their generation wear their resentment on their unironed sleeves. A stone Starbucks clerk, after asking me to endlessly repeat my order for a grande coffee, then repeating it to himself, asked me, what were you having? So he's basically it's hard and dirty to read through this, but his whole thing is he spent half of his article saying that boomers accomplished some pretty great stuff, and then he used a little bit of shaky logic there that we kind of diffused a little bit, and then the rest of his article is, but look at millennials, aren't they lazy, stupid, and aren't they, they can't even get my coffee order right, which is kind of the most entitled boomer thing that you could do to end an article trying to defend your generation. And the reason we're reading this and not something like David Lord Willett's, but the boomer version, the reason we're reading this and not something that is like better constructed as a defense for boomers is because this is the most popular one online. If you type in the words, boomer hatred unjustified, or, millennials shouldn't hate boomers, or anything like that, any combination of those words, you pop up the Stephen Cuso article from the New York Post. There is also Sam Hill. He does Newsweek. His entire article, he tries to defend boomers too, and his is like the second most search article defending boomers. And almost all of his methods of defense are claiming that millennial complaints aren't as bad as how boomers had it. He says, quote, opioids? You think that's bad? We had heroin and crack. But there's a difference there. Like I'm gonna argue that one just because that is an ignorant statement.
No, I could speak to that too. The drugs and the fentanyl is more deadly than any time. I mean, they're making drugs more potent, including weed. Everything, meth, heroin, everything's gotten more dangerous.
Yeah, and there's a very, very, very important thing he totally leaves out there. Yes, boomers had it bad with crack and heroin, but those were illegal. Like our generation has faced, and boomers have faced this too. They were taking the same opioids, but opioids are worse because they were legal. Like they were being prescribed by doctors. And we we have regulations against crack and heroin. um but also, if you look at any article whatsoever, preventable overdoses has gone up 800% since 1999. So again, that's another argument defending boomers that just completely and totally falls flat against the massive percentages that have risen.
Is that is that adjusted for per capita? Because there are so many more people in the world. There's more of everything, right?
Yeah,
There's more crime in the world, but you're less likely to be a victim of a crime because the world's bigger.
That is a very good point. Thank you. Yeah, it's adjusted. That is from the National Safety Council. We will have a link to that. I know that every single stat I bring up, usually the arguments that come up when you bring up a stat like that is a per capita. With the money one, is it adjusted for inflation? So we're going to link to everything because we don't want people we don't want to throw out a very bold sounding statistic and not have it available to read. But yeah, he also gives boomers credit for racial progress. But in an unrelated, okay, so he says boomers led racial progress in America, but he literally wrote an article the year before, said a timeline of racial progress and the lack of it. So he destroyed his own argument. Like in that paragraph, he basically destroyed his own argument because he has written about how little progress there's been. I guess to recap, boomers lived through communism. They were approximately 13 in age. Like the oldest boomers were 13 around the age of Woodstock. So the whole idea of we started free love and fought against the establishment and the strict button up starch collar world that the greatest generation had built. They actually kind of didn't. They were around 13 years of age at best during Woodstock. So if they were there, they were young and they were consumers of the revolution that was going on. They built business and infrastructure around the tech boom. A lot of the tech wizards were younger than boomers, but infrastructure isn't cheap. And building that out as a building tech businesses, I'm not going to take that away from anybody. Our world is technologically where it is because of baby boomers. Taxes are much lower than they were in 1969. But again, that's at the cost of regulation and safety nets. Like I wouldn't send my kid to a school right now, like a public school. Which is again, if you have your hand on the lever of Congress and have for 40 years, then that's what you do. You just make it easier on yourself and your generation cohort. That's not selfishness. I don't think that is just you're doing what will make your life easier as you age. And it so happens that those regulations also make it harder for the generations below you. And Sam Hill's article also brings up something interesting, which is boomers connected the world. In 1969, a 10-minute long distance phone call would cost you $15.
That's before your time, too. You don't understand that either.
Oh, no, I made collect calls in high school.
Oh, you did?
I did.
From the state pen, right? You get to collect calls. But other than that,
that's where it was from.
You called after 9 p.m. because there were long distance rates. They had some scams back in the day, too.
Right.
$1,000 phone bills were a thing.
I'll tell you how cheap I was. Collect was just going away when I was in school. I would call collect and I'd do that dumb thing where it says, say your name. I would say my message in 10 seconds instead of my name. Like I'd be like, I'll be home later. Or just, I'll be home at 9. Yeah.
That's funny.
I really honestly tried to find good science to prove that boomers are the best generation. Like some of these articles claim. I found a study in Edinburgh, University of Edinburgh, that was interviewed 55 boomer grandparents, and they pointed out that boomers in the current economy, a record number of boomers are choosing to take care of their grandchildren instead of continuing jobs or continuing their own pursuits, because millennials can't afford childcare. If you try to get what is it called, daycare for your kid while you're working, it's like $800 a week. It is an insane, mind-blowing number that is impossible. So many boomer grandparents are. I actually met one of these people. We had it was like a birthday party for my fiance's parents, and one of the guests was like, "I'm a teacher, but I'm literally retiring this year because I make less than it would cost to take care of our the grandkids." Like, she's like, "My pay as a teacher is less than $800 a week," and she's like, I'm saving money by quitting my job to take care of the kids.
Sad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These boomers aren't doing it entirely selflessly. They're not making the next generation better. They're just taking care of their grandkids like it's their flesh and blood in most cases. But it is still something where, like, it's something. Like, it is, they are contributing to the next generation in a way. Just not in Congress, not in voting. I know I keep laughing throughout this episode, but it's just so weird to read this stuff and read the stats and be like, okay, yeah, this is what happens if you have power for that long. We are now at the fruits of the labor, the insane, crazy twist of what happens when you don't regulate housing investment and housing. Did you hear the article that came out last week about baby boomers becoming homeless?
No.
As more people struggle to make ends meet, a startling number of those newly homeless are baby boomers.
When you said that, I was kind of shocked because I think of them being just well off. I mean, house paid off, money in the bank. Yeah, far from homeless.
Right. Like I think of I think of what the Saturday Night Live skit said. Like Saturday Night Live is like, this is a parrot head boomer that lives in Key West and she has 3 houses and got a severance.
Yeah, complaining about the cost of complaining about menial things like oil changes and haircut. I remember when a haircut was it was $2, and
Right.
Yeah.
So
but not hurting for anything.
Yeah, exactly. Like complaining but not hurting. This article came out November 4th by Sarah Lewis, and this is on Yahoo Financial page, and the title is quote, "Unconscionable. American baby boomers are now becoming homeless at a rate not seen since the Great Depression. Here's what's driving the terrible trend." So in the article, it basically talks about how we have now hit a tipping point. These are my favorite episodes to do, is when we hit a tipping point and we pass 50% of anything. We had an episode a while back about the tipping point for college degrees, that now more than 50% or about 50% of people don't think they're worth it. Like parents, half of parents are saying, don't bother getting a degree. You're not going to pay it back. We've reached the tipping point for boomers and housing. So let's step back a little bit. 1990, about 10% of homeless were 50 and older. I think of homeless people, I don't know why, this is me being dumb, I think of homeless people as being older. I usually think of like a scruffy bearded dude with a sign that says "Please help." But that's not the case. Those are the visible homeless, and those are like the older homeless who are like cardboard sign begging for change in a city, which is where I worked. By the way, I worked in downtown Portland.
Which there's a mix where we have a lot of homeless children and stuff. So maybe, your self-awareness was off a bit, right?
It totally was, yeah. I was wrong on that. Back in 1990, only 10 or 11% were 50 and older. So most homeless, the majority of them were under 50, so young, relatively young. And that, I can see that being part of the housing crisis. That went up slowly, by the way. In 2003, 37% were 50 and older. So now you're getting into like, what is that? Gen X reaching retirement? No, who's older than boomers? That would be the silent generation reaching retirement and not having enough money, basically. So 37% of the homeless were 50 and older. Now it's gotten crazy. This article breaks the news that like, let's see, who reported on this? Dennis Coolhan of the University of Pennsylvania, who is a social policy professor, and UCSF, which is University of California, San Francisco. They're reporting on these rates. A 2020 journal from the American Society on Aging. So like there's a couple sources who have verified this, and basically it's 50% or more homeless now today, 2023, are boomer age. They're 50 and older. So half of the homeless are people who we associate with having boomer money. like the Saturday Night Live skit and all those like people bashing on boomers, saying that they're a selfish generation. They've taken everything. They made the policies to favor themselves. They have all the money, and turns out at the end, half of the people entering into homelessness are boomer generation. The number one quoted reason for homelessness.
To say why?
It's housing and rental costs. The number one quoted reason for homelessness of the older generation, the boomer generation entering homelessness, they're saying that rental costs exceeded their retirement, housing costs exceeded their retirement, or that they were forced to sell or pressured to sell. There's a bunch of articles that like have examples of this, but we'll just sort of like briefly walk through how that happens. During our housing episode where we talked about investor groups that are buying houses as a board of investors literally are buying houses out of state, turning them into rentals, and then using those rentals as sort of like a farm. Like they're fleecing rent from people because they charge the most amount. How this happens is you have a boomer who owns their 3 retirement houses that could have gone to a single family. Instead, they're using them as an Airbnb. And that boomer, has somebody come in and offer them, like we said earlier, like they are offered a tremendous amount of money to sell. They sell, and then they have less income, like less retirement, less income. And, like they have a bubble of money that they use or spend or whatever. And then after that's gone, they are now down to paying their own rent or their own rental or their own upkeep or whatever they're doing. And as that happens, the neighborhood around them gets bought up by companies or other groups or investment groups that are doing the same thing. So like they get surrounded by rentals, and eventually the cost of living, the crazy inflation that's going on right now. A head of lettuce is $5. Like milk is, eggs are $10. Like you have to trade gold bullion to get your hands on some bacon. That's all happening. Their meds are going up. And what ends up happening is they slowly get housing crushed. They get rental crushed, especially if you live in the city. That's a big thing. We talked about how Jared Kushner owns like 9,000 rental units in the city. His company does. And then he got like an infusion of cash from like Saudi Arabia for like $2 billion. So like this is something that is very, very valuable. Housing and using houses as a fleecing system has become extraordinarily valuable. And it's leading to half of all homeless being boomers. And while I see this as a serious fucking problem, having so many aging Americans about to face, medical crises, because when you have older people on the street, they are medically vulnerable. And meanwhile, millennials, my generation, are reading this and are making jokes on Twitter. And I'm going to read a couple to you.
That's not cool. That's more bullying, right?
It is bullying. Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that's probably why the SNL skit isn't on YouTube, for the same reason, because at this point, like it used to be funny. Like 10 years ago, it was like boomers had all the money, all the power, and all the votes. So like it's funny to punch up. Now it's starting to punch down because boomers are going homeless at record rates. Somebody on Twitter said, something bootstraps. And again, a lot of these are Reagan jokes because boomers, as a voting cohort, favored Reagan and his policies. Another millennial tweeted, "Did it not trickle down?" ? Here's kind of one of my favorite ones. Somebody said, "I told my dad to stop eating all that avocado toast and drinking all those lattes. He should have saved more."
Now we know where Saturday Night Live got its content, right?
Right, exactly. But yeah, we'll link to an article, a very old one. This is an article from '84 from the New York Times that is, it's called "Baby Boomers Appear to Rally Around Reagan." It's the number of support that Reagan had from baby boomers. So going into the future, this is the crazy part to me. I don't see this as a boomer versus millennial problem. And now we get into my tinfoil hat territory, if that's okay. That's how a lot of episodes end. I'm sorry for that. You don't ever have tinfoil hat moments. Why is it that on the episodes you have like kind, wise advice at the end? I put on a tinfoil hat. You can hear it crinkle, and then we get into anyway.
Pretentious prick.
That's why. That's the truth of it. I don't see this as a boomer versus millennial problem. I see this as a boomer versus boomer problem, except that it is the voting cohort who could have established regulations on housing is now losing all their houses. Meanwhile, the boomers in Congress and Senate, half of them are boomers. And here's something else that's fun if you want to talk numbers in Congress. Half of Congress also has something else, which is stocks in housing rental companies and rental properties as assets. So like the very problem that is causing boomers to lose their houses quicker at accelerating rates is something that both boomers in Congress are overrepresented and boomers in Congress have a absurd amount of rental properties and properties as assets, which means that they're not going to vote this down. Like the trend of boomers voting for things that make their life more comfortable, especially in Congress and Senate, that's going to continue. And it's continuing in a way where it is now upper class versus lower class. And again, like that's their retirement. Like the old argument of when David Lord Willett put out the call for maybe we shouldn't turn all of the single family homes that millennials need into investments. And boomers responded with, but it's our right to invest in whatever we see is the best investment that we can make. Like it's our right to, work on a good retirement and a sound financial plan. That is the exact argument that congressmen and senators are making is we own assets in rental and Jared Kushner has, 9 million rental slums in New York and all these people who are gobbling up the houses and turning them into assets. The exact argument they make is what the argument boomers made in Lord Willett's day, which is this is our retirement. It is our right to build that out, to have a smart portfolio and have smart investments. I also want to point out before we end this episode that there are polling places like Gallup who have stopped recognizing generations. Like Adam Conover from Adam Runs Everything has said this too, that generation gaps are kind of made up. They're made up for the ease and convenience of getting polling numbers and for separating people into age cohorts, so it's easier to like keep track of who's voting for what and who was born in what generation and what happened. I don't know if I truck with that. I will just recognize that some people just say generations are totally made up. It doesn't matter. It's just who is currently old enough to have stock in what is what determines things. So it's the fabrication of boomers, millennials, and Gen Xers, that's all made up. It doesn't mean anything. I will simply restate that I kind of believe in generation gaps, but I also don't believe that any generation is softer, meaner, more stupid, or more compassionate than any other generation. they're just raised with different expectations.
Well said. That was a pretty positive spin. You've been listening to The Re-Engineered You. Thank you so much for listening to the show. You mean the world to us. We have a new episode every week.
You can connect with us at www.re-engineeredyou.com. That's where we have research links, show notes, feedback, and blog articles for each of our episodes.
We're not experts in anything, but we've got an opinion on everything.